Thank you.
Yeah. Good. So now we are going to start our 2 lectures concerning the current tragic, terrible events happening in Ukraine. The 2 lectures are going to be delivered by Ukrainian Marxists. The first one is going to be delivered by Volodymyr Artiukh, currently affiliated with Oxford University and doing research on the history of imperialism, history of Eastern Europe, urban history, and history of the social movements. Volodymyr is going to talk about Russian imperialism. Russian imperialism, especially about its most recent history, the last 8 years in the run-up to the current invasion of Ukraine, and to see how Russian imperialism differs from the imperialism we perhaps know best, the American one, in that Russian imperialism prioritizes militaristic ways of solving its issues, but also cooptation of elites, rather than work with broader civil societies. So thank you very much, Volodymyr, for agreeing to lecture for us. So you are having 35-40 minutes. And after that, we are going to have 25-20 minutes for questions and answers. Thank you very much. It's really great to have you. Let us begin.
Thank you, Vladimir. First of all, express my gratitude to the organizers of this event for letting me speak here. I have to make a small correction about myself. The history of Russian imperialism isn't really my focus of my research. I'm an anthropologist for most of my time, work time, and I study social movements and work and mobility. But I'm also a Marxist in my other avatar as one of the editors, together with Alona, of the journal which is called Commons. And within this framework, we have theoretical discussions about the world politics and about this war. We have been developing certain thoughts about the nature of Russian imperialism. We were engaged in certain debates. And this, what I'm going to present, is an outcome of this more or less common theoretical work, but of course, all of the mistakes are my own. What I'm going to be talking about today are rather changing strategies of Russian imperialism than an attempt to define its nature or its some sort of timeless features. The necessity of this, obviously, is that the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian war poses this question, the question of imperialism, with a renewed urgency. And without answering this question, we as Marxists and members of progressive movements in our countries have hard time developing appropriate political strategies and communication strategies. That's because whereas Marxist scholarship of the last 30 years focused on the American new imperialism, to use David Harvey's definition, non-American imperialisms has been only marginally theorized, although there were attempts, for example, the notion of sub-imperialism. Meanwhile, the focus on the American hegemonic imperialism leads to misrecognition of other moments in the increasingly acute inter-imperialist rivalry, including the nature and dynamic of the Russian expansionism. The very dynamic of this type of non-American imperialism is very important because it influences the way we frame our strategy. So in this contribution today, I will trace several tendencies characteristic of the Russian foreign policy in the last 2 decades that point to a distinctive character of Russian imperialism. I will analyze Russia's strategies of struggling for control over Ukraine, Syria, Belarus, and the practices of control over the population in Ukraine, in the newly occupied territories of Ukraine since the start of this war. And I will distinguish the following features of the Russian imperialism. First of all, it's the preference for political territorial over economic influence and control, preference of inter-elite alliances over the control of civil society, and a reliance on domination over hegemony in internal politics and foreign policy. In this talk, I propose that Russia's aggressive foreign policy is neither a defensive reaction against the US imperialism, nor a historically determined inevitability, but a conjunctural phenomenon characteristic of the decline of the US hegemony. And while tracing this tendency, I use the language of the theories and language of Antonio Gramsci as it has been applied to international relations by several Marxist scholars. So Russian officials claim that they challenged the American hegemony. Lavrov's vision of a multipolar world is supposed to be a diplomatic translation of this claim. He issues a rallying cry against American imperialism while stressing that Russia doesn't strive for a world hegemony. And I would claim that in this very specific sense, the Russian officials are correct. However, the claim that Russian leadership doesn't strive for hegemony means something else than what Lavrov would want to say, because imperialism is not always hegemonic. Hegemony is intellectual and moral leadership, as defined by Gramsci. In international relations, hegemony is an extension of the economic and political powers of the ruling elite of a powerful country outside of the borders of this country. Such an extension aligns the prevalent interests of the hegemonic elite with the subordinated or subaltern interests of their associates in subordinated countries, primarily by establishing international economic, cultural, and political institutions. In a hegemonic situation, these asymmetric interests are coordinated on global fora, and military violence is used as an instrument of last resort, mostly in the periphery. In this sense, Russian Federation under Putin transited from an attempt of becoming a regional hegemon to a non-hegemonic strategy of a regional domination. According to the political economist Ilya Matveyev, Russian imperialism relies on the economic logic of expanding private interests, private business interests, but it did it in a limited window of time. This strategy that was similar to the American imperialist, new imperialism prevailed in the years 2000. However, the Kremlin shifted to the territorial logic of imperialism around the year 2014 and started pursuing political and military control over the territories of interest, even at the expense of the interests of capitalists, individual capitalists. The distinction between the economic and territorial logic of imperialism comes also from David Harvey. This new political military logic was clearly formulated, in my opinion, in Putin's UN speech in 2015, which follows and ideologically justifies this shift in the Russian imperialist strategy. In his speech, Putin stressed sovereignty and legitimacy as cornerstones of Russia's foreign policy in the aftermath of the Arab Spring and the Maidan Revolution. He defines sovereignty as freedom to do whatever a state wants, and legitimacy indirectly as an ability to preserve power based on a traditional way of life, despite popular protests. Borrowing a term from the 19th century counter-revolutionary thought, I would call this a legitimist strategy. Legitimism meaning reliance on aristocratic and royal ancestry to claim for rule. The most salient early examples of this new strategy was, of course, the annexation of Crimea and the support for the pro-Russian rebels in Donbass. However, leading up to the war with Ukraine, the strategy expanded to include the reactivation of other frozen conflicts in Georgia in 2008 that slightly predated this turn, and it's foreshadowed rather its turn, and possibly Moldova in the nearest future. It also included military involvement in domestic conflicts, as it was in Ukraine 2014 after the war in Donbass started, in Belarus in 2020 in an indirect manner, and finally in Kazakhstan in January 2022. And finally, it included provision of military services, as it happened in Syria and in several African countries. The central tenet of this legitimist territorial strategy was the conservation or restoration of neo-patrimonial regimes threatened by popular discontent. Neo-patrimonial is a word borrowed from Weberian tradition of political thought. It means a type of political legitimacy that is based on private and private traditional connections rather than bureaucratic or democratic legitimacy. The Donbass breakaway statelets were the first in a series of regimes that started appearing in the post-Soviet space since 2014 in reaction to the real or perceived threat of popular protests. And they call such forms of governments that appeared in Donbass anti-Maidan regimes in reference to the first legitimizing narrative of resisting Ukraine's Maidan protests. What unites them, such anti-Maidan regimes, is the fact that they are reactions to popular urban uprisings. And they prefer depolitization rather than mobilization of their populations. They rely on police and military coercion rather than a hegemonic project that is a picture of a better, more prosperous future, just and prosperous future. As opposed to the 19th century legitimists, however, these anti-Maidan legitimists are not grounded in royal genealogies, but rather in whatever status quo that preceded historical revolutionary breaks, such as the Great Russian Revolution, breakup of the Soviet Union, or the urban revolutions of the post-global crisis period. As Russian historian Ilya Budraitskis pointed out, Putin abhors discontinuities in the course of history. He thrives on reconstructing a continuous history of the rulers, from the south of Muscovy to Russian emperors to Stalin and finally to himself. Therefore, it would not be misleading to borrow another term from the 19th century European political history and describe Putin's imperialist strategy as a holy alliance of political capitalism. In the early 19th century, the Holy Alliance was a coalition of monarchies presided by Russia and directed against bourgeois revolutions. In the rest of the 19th century, The Russian Empire played the role of gendarme, of policeman of Europe, helping suppress bourgeois and socialist uprisings after the so-called Spring of the Nations in 1848. As elites in need joined this new Holy Alliance, their regimes transformed accordingly. And this includes Assad's Syria, Lukashenko's Belarus, and most recently Kazakhstan, and finally the newly occupied regions of Ukraine. And bringing this logic back home, Russia's own regime has undergone a transformation into an authoritarian police state with post-fascist tendencies. Such elites that join this alliance come from post-developmental neo-patrimonial regimes that have been in different stages of decline and stood in different relations with their neighbors. By post-developmental, I mean that they had to abandon state-led developmental efforts that were common in the 80s in the Arab world and in, of course, Soviet-led bloc, and switch to some forms of the broadly defined Washington consensus, that is market-based forms. And this led to many theories. This led to the wave of uprisings after the crisis of 2008. Thus, these regimes in decline survived or collapsed depending on what prior connections they had, prior political connections they had in their environment. Thus, the Tunisian and Belarusian regimes, being able to rely on their patrons and having stronger states, were able to overcome the uprisings at the cost of increasing dependence on foreign powers. France for Tunisia and Russia for in case of Belarus. Others suffered the intervention of their neighbors, as it happened in Bahrain, Yemen, or Ukraine. Still others plunged into prolonged civil wars, such as Libya and Syria, and became a direct battleground of competition for the US, Turkish, and Russian imperialism. The elites of such states were in search of foreign support, but the US demonstrated a failure of its hegemonic claims, both in the core and on the periphery of the world system. And here I use hegemony in a Gramscian, Hegelian sense as a set of institutions and ideologies buttressed by the potentiality of the use of credible force that can overcome crisis and align the interests of core and peripheral elites. And this broke down. Whereas the US central bank managed somehow to mitigate the crisis of 2008 in Europe, it failed to establish order in its periphery. Similarly, the US military operations brought unintended consequences in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And once this hegemonic hole opened and the US showed its weakness, the contenders immediately sprang to action, offering their help to restore order. One of such hegemonic contenders was Russia, who successfully invented ways of fighting with the internal challenges since the middle-class protests of 2011 and 13 against, these were electoral protests against basically the return of Putin. Since domination in international relations, according to Gramsci, is an extension of the modes of domination of the ruling class inside the country, the Kremlin offered its internal policy tools to its embattled international dependencies. Thus, Russia came up with a doctrine of the support of legitimate regimes, so-called legitimate regimes, against the hybrid wars, as they call them, waged by the West. And this was an alternative to the faltering US hegemony based on the promotion of democracy, including the support of popular uprisings. In Gramscian terms, this was an offer of the preservation of the historical bloc that is based on Caesarist domination rather than hegemony, a Caesarist type of domination, according to Gramsci, is an extension of what Marx called Bonapartist domination. That is balancing a power that usurps the executive power and dominates other classes and groups, but also balances between their interests. Thus, as opposed to the faltering US hegemony, Russia offered an international system of domination without hegemony. Such an offer would solve two tasks: expanding the rule of the Russian domestic regime and ensuring the stability of the regimes of the states that joined the Holy Alliance. A series of successes against the background of the American and European failures emboldened the Russian elites in the world arena. While Russia reinstated the power of Assad in Syria, exported their services to African countries, and crashed protests at home, the US was mired in the Trump shit show internally. It was nearly losing NATO allies. It announced a pivot to Asia and was losing miserably at its withdrawal from Afghanistan in August 2021. The only unfinished business for the Holy Alliance on the background of this seemingly collapsing US hegemony was Ukraine. Since the beginning of 2020, Russia started integrating the separatist statelets in Donbass into the Russian ideological, economic, and political sphere, while simultaneously pressing the Ukrainian authorities to hastily implement the political part of the Minsk agreements. According to the then views of the Russian authorities, that would dismember Ukraine, and Ukraine would be more or less with the least amount of expenditure incorporated to Russia directly and split into parts that it would control indirectly. Thus, the war in Ukraine, when the Kremlin saw that this previous piecemeal strategy didn't work, this war was not a necessity, but a PR act. It was a way to advertise its services to their prospective allies, a way to show that the Kremlin was powerful enough to do what the US was unable to do in its European front. And this opportunity to show its strengths came in late 2021 and early 2020, when many factors converged that would weaken the West and embolden Russia. And Russian elites grasped this opportunity. The US and Europe were hit by the pandemic and faced political tensions. But on the other hand, for Russia, things were doing great. Belarus was securely under Russia's control as a poster child of the new Holy Alliance. Russia's economy stabilized and accumulated all-time high resources. Finally, the lightning fast special operation in Kazakhstan proved that Russia is a reliable donor of security. That special operation was kind of a coalition effort by Russia's allies in January 22 to suppress the quite chaotic protests that were raging in Kazakhstan. The US seemed powerless to counteract this crisis. And it was in this context that Putin and Medvedev wrote their texts about Ukraine as part of the tripartite nation, and about Zelensky, who is dependent and weak. And essentially, this was an ultimatum. Either Ukraine would be destroyed as a state, which was presented by the Russians then as by the Russian leadership then as an historical inevitability, because American hegemony is collapsing and Ukraine would be destroyed consequently. Or it would be refashioned according to the Russian will, and those who embrace this offer inside Ukraine would prosper. And by this I mean, of course, political entrepreneurs, individuals, not the masses of the people. While constructing the system of anti-Maidan regimes that I mentioned before, such as in Donbass, Russia has also been transforming itself from a managed democracy into a police state with post-fascist tendencies, and imposing a postmodern mix of ideologies that are not meant to truly persuade the masses. In place of a hegemonic project of the American rules-based order, the Kremlin offers pure violence, the technology of violence to its clients abroad, as means of reinforcing their legitimacy inside their country. And in my opinion, this is the essence of what Lavrov calls the multipolar world. It's a world that is based on an alliance of these neo-patrimonial regimes that are transforming themselves into more centralized, more police and violence-based states that ensure the control over their population, not by means of a certain coherent ideology, or as Gramsci would call it, a hegemonic project of development, of an economic expansion and expansion of certain values and so on, but on very limited possible economic gains and very limited and the offer of value of a limited participation of elites in their rule, and this is essentially the non-hegemonic nature of this imperialism. And here I come back to where I started when I said that Putin and Lavrov are right by saying that they are challenging the American hegemony. But by challenging these, they don't offer they don't offer the world free of imperialist domination. They offer a different form of domination in the form of an alliance and mutual support of these Caesarist regimes in times of crisis, and chiefly in times when this crisis comes from below, from the challenge of popular support. And in this broad context, and here I wrap up my talk. In this broad context, the war in Ukraine should not be treated as a defensive act by Russia. It should not be treated as a response to some sort of expansion of the US hegemony. Quite to the contrary. The war in Ukraine is an offensive act. It's an act of expanding Russia's power in the context of the perceived weakness of the US. In this context, the Russian elite gamble that this call, that their initiative will be supported and abetted by other great powers, chiefly China. And by this, they this investment in pure force, this investment in destruction, will also pay off economically later. So there is a long-term calculation. And here I disagree with those who say that Russia has already lost by invading Ukraine. It has gambled. But the issue, the question of whether it has lost and who has lost is, of course, something to be answered retrospectively in the course of time. And here the question, and here we can pose the question of the strategy of the left. What the left should do in their respective countries, whether they should focus on countering the US hegemony, or whether they should support Ukraine as their cause. And in answering this question, I think the development of the analysis of this war in the context of the recent 2 decades is essential, because this analysis underlines all the position taking. It underlies all the current debates chiefly in the Western left around this war. A clear understanding of the nature of Russian imperialism and its conjunctural moves will give us better means at formulating our positions and consequently translating them into strategies. The last one example, and it's the last, I will finish my talk here, is the distribution of the forces of various progressive organizations in organizing protests or spreading messages to their prospective support base. The recent experience of the protests in Europe, for example, showed that anti-imperialist or the so-called anti-war messages and demonstrations, they don't gain mass support, and they don't gain mass support chiefly not because the European population is so militant and they are so keen on reviving the US hegemony. These messages didn't caught mass support because the population doesn't feel that they are being part of an expanding hegemonic project. They feel that they are in battle. They feel that they are being attacked rather than being the attackers. And in this context, more successful, more consequential strategy for the left was focusing on more immediate economic and political domestic consequences of this war. And the recent protests and strikes in the UK and in France and in the US itself show that this strategy, the strategy of more immediate and more probably corporatist claims making is more successful in organization building and in influencing and in using the building a leverage for changes inside their countries. And without strong left-wing organizations, without strong organization capacities, the global analysis and internationalism in general will not have political consequences on the ground. As much as we would call for stopping the war, as much as we would wish the violence to stop and rush to withdraw their forces and so on, we would never achieving it by just gathering some small demonstrations and then quickly dispersing, or by arguing incessantly on Facebook or on social media. We would only make at least a small difference when we already have organizational, financial, and political capacities on the ground in their respective countries. And articulating these demands, developing the analysis and developing organizational capacities is of course not a banal thing, but this question should be posed again. And here I would end my talk. I would apologize that I diverged slightly at the end, but I think that a Marxist analysis should inevitably pose a practical question, and they should be read and used in the context of a practical development. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I absolutely agree with you. Marxist analysis is supposed to be a conduit to praxis, and that's exactly what differentiates Marxism from other methodologies in social sciences. In our case, theory and praxis are supposed to be fused together. So thank you very much for an extremely interesting presentation on the Russian strategy of domination via, well, naked force and building of inter-elite alliances, rather than the hegemonic strategy of co-opting civil society, or, for example, offering some sort of attractive picture of future ideal society. So it's extremely interesting. I have lots of questions to you, in fact. But first and foremost, I guess I should ask the other listeners whether they have questions. And when it comes to questioning, we have two ways of doing it. The first is that you use the icon, you have the reactions here, you can raise your electronic hand as I do now. So you raise your electronic hand and then you just ask your question orally. It's the easiest thing to do. But if you are not necessarily wishing to do it this way, another alternative would be, please use the chat function. If you write your question in chat so that everyone can read it, then I will read it to our speaker and get the answer. So let us start then. Who is going to ask the first question? I have, as I have said, lots of questions myself, but I ask my questions last. Any questions? I'm sure that there would be certain things that people would be interested in asking, because again, it's also a practical issue for the South Korean left, because South Korea is much more involved in the current events than many people seemingly think. South Korea is now one of the main suppliers of weapons to Poland and indirectly to Ukraine. So, and South Korea actually earned a lot on its weapon supplies. Now it entered the list of top 7 exporters of weapons now, chiefly thanks to its weapon deliveries to Poland in relationship to the current events. So it affects South Korea a lot. It also affects the decision of South Korea's ruling circles now to conclude a de facto military alliance with Japan, very controversial inside South Korea, and United States. It's a sort of a triangle now that is more or less being finished under the current extremely conservative administration. So the war in Ukraine affected South Korea in many diverse ways. So I wonder if there are any questions. Paul, would you like to ask something?
Yes, I could ask something.
Of course.
And this is a very complicated topic. But I missed. I'm an American, okay? So I am particularly concerned about my own country's acts rather than somebody else's. Or at least I have a particular responsibility. And I will say two things, but really I can't speak to everything I think in such a short time. But I did not understand from the very beginning of the war why. Now I'm not. I mean, I do understand, but if you really think that Putin is or the Russian regime is responsible, then there was a test. The test would have been for Zelensky and the government to withdraw the assertion that it would join NATO and basically call Putin's and the Russian government's hand that the expansion of NATO was the key question involved. I take it from your talk that you don't think the expansion of NATO is a key question, but that the key question is Russian imperialism. And I don't think I agree. And or at least what is the principal question? And then the only other thing I want to say quickly is a prediction that the Ukraine will lose and Russia will win. I'm excluding the possibility of nuclear war. I'm just predicting that Russia, that the Western powers will not go down, will not send its own troops in and act as a NATO force, and that the Ukraine is going to lose, even if the West makes some noises claiming it's not going. But whatever, I don't think the end result is going to be what Zelensky is posing. So I think that's all I really want to say in such a short discussion.
Okay. So, but that was, I think, a remark rather than question, or perhaps it's a
I
question.
can briefly react. I can briefly react to that. It's these are really the questions that that often posed in the debates in the debates like this. I think no. I mean the issue of NATO membership for Ukraine was a real issue. It wasn't completely inessential. It would have the way Zelensky handled it could have influenced some mid-term or short-term developments. But at that particular point in time, at the end of the year 2021, and after Lavrov rolled out these security concerns proposals, I think it already was a non-issue. There is a report. There was a report in one of Russia's newspapers that Kazak, the guy who was responsible for Minsk developments, Minsk talks, He seemingly reached an agreement with Zelensky that he would withdraw this NATO claim, and Putin was already not interested in that. If Zelensky really did it and really followed it through, he would have faced significant domestic opposition to that from the nationalists and from part of liberal civil society, and he would have been significantly weakened. And knowing that Russia was already talking about this integration of Donbass and so on and so forth, this would present the Russians an opportunity to what they would call restore constitutional order, that is introduce their troops in Ukraine, facing much less resistance than they did. I think that in this kind of in the perspective of these years from late 2020, 21, the issue of whether making a move on Ukraine or not on part of Russia was already decided. And I think it wasn't decided because Russia was afraid of NATO expansion. It was decided because Russia made a gamble. I don't mean Russia as all people. I mean Kremlin. The Kremlin made a gamble that they will raise the stakes and they will win, and that was it. I think that the issue of NATO could have changed the form of this conflict, but I don't think it was a way to avoid it. And I think that I mean, you see this, that Finland and Sweden are joining NATO, and it's not like causing any significant kind of reaction from Russia and so on. So I mean, yeah, well, it's a complicated, it kind of this question of NATO expansion, it requires a lot of really minutious, careful political historical reconstruction of what happened. It's not something that I can even now say with 100% sureness. Yeah, but that so far is my point of view based on what we know. Yeah. The second question about the end of this conflict, who wins and who loses, is there's just I would not predict anything at this point, and I would not gamble. I think that that this war will end in a way that by now we can't really predict that much. We can roll out several scenarios, ascribing certain possibilities, probabilities to these scenarios, and based on that we could develop our strategies. But this would take a long time to describe it. So I just, in discussing the question of how the war will end and so on, I would just move away from certainties and into a field of probabilities, right? And that would be kind of more fruitful politically, I think. Okay, I will end here. So it's gonna be long.
Thank you very much for your reaction. And just to add, I have read about this Kazakh-Zelensky agreement in no less than Financial Times. So it has been reported in several outlets, both Russian and Western, and Kazakh never denied it. So, which means that at the very earliest, the very beginning stage of the war, there was a semblance of preliminary agreement between one of Putin's most trusted aides and Zelensky gave up on Ukrainian NATO membership, but that obviously didn't stop the invasion. So yes, I'm also of the opinion that it was not the issue at that stage. It was no longer the issue. So, but then I wonder if there are any other questions on chat, or if you just raise. Alona raised her hand, so please, yes, please.
But just if there are no other questions, I wonder, of course, it's probably better to ask people who study US imperialism. But after a year, did the Russia-Ukrainian war actually strengthen American imperialism? Because at least on the ideological level in Ukraine, it seems that more people do support, you know, the Western camp. Like if we take a look at the surveys, and of course it's very obvious from interviews that people who before were against NATO, now they support it, though still being critical to this, but in the situation of no choice, people decide to be pro-NATO in Ukraine. But if we talk about contemporary state of American imperialism, does it, you know, and yeah, so you understood my question.
Yeah, so did the war conversely strengthen the hand of America in Ukraine anyway?
Yeah, well, not only in Ukraine, obviously that it led to a huge kind of securitization of everything in Europe too, and in Ukraine for sure. But this, and this is something we need to work with as Marxists. We can't just ignore it. We can't just say that yes, still NATO is bad. You are all deluded, and yeah, you just have to abandon NATO, and that will be great. No, it's of course not how we should proceed. We work with the common sense, which the people, which is our raw material, and as Alona said, this common sense is often contradictory. People know what NATO is, and they know that it's not some kind of benign but benevolent, you know, force, that it has its drawbacks, but they calculate rationally the chances of their security, and yeah, they think that NATO is beneficial to them. In many countries in Europe, of course, this shift happened. I already mentioned Finland and Sweden, and this is something we should work with, but in a clever way, not by just telling people they're stupid, but by working on the contradictions within this common sense, and by offering alternatives, by talking about a form of security that could come after NATO, or that we should work for as progressive movements. And this is something that is completely neglected in Marxist and broadly left-wing analysis of these events. We simply don't have a good security proposals, and they are articulated sometimes by people like McDonnell in the UK, sorry, or the progressive side of the liberals in the US, by simply embracing NATO, which is not a great response. So the task is to take into account people's security concerns, rather than the security concerns of the Kremlin elite or someone else. But doing it in a clever manner is the ground that we haven't yet worked on. That's
Yes, I can just add to this is that I have relatives in Finland. My sister is Finnish. She lives in Finland. So, and I know that there the memories of Soviet Finnish was still very much alive. It goes in generations. It's a part of family folklore. So when they feel threatened, there is a good historical background to this. And especially if you think that it used to be a Russian colony. So certainly those things we cannot simply dismiss it. It's post-colonial memory, basically. And we need more clever strategies for working with this sort of demand for security, especially on Russian borderlands, obviously. So, but I wonder if we have 4 minutes remained. So I wonder if there are any other questions here. Okay, I don't see any raised hands. So if there are no questions, then my question was, but it's too big to answer in 4 minutes. So what perhaps we can do is that I ask you the question, and then after the event ends, we just have a personal talk. Well, what I was
Maybe just yes or no question.
Yeah. So, no, what you said that Russian imperialism perhaps lacks this sort of hegemonic apparatus that American imperialism has developed to a very high degrees, way of co-opting people or inducing them to think what Washington actually considers right. The thing is that I'm not sure, because I look into Russian Russophone diasporas in Europe, and I'm always startled by how many people are Putinists there. I mean, how strong Russian propaganda stands among the people who otherwise are very much exposed to other propagandas as well. So they are not captive market. I mean, inside Russia, certainly it's a semi-captive market, because obviously people have sometimes limited access to other opinions. But here it's a free market, and it's quite shocking to me, but on this free market, Russian hegemonic apparatus of propaganda is quite competitive. So they offer narratives which obviously are enticing. And they are competitive in Europe, but if you go outside to Middle East, for example, India or China, they will be much more competitive there. The thing is that, for example, in the Middle Eastern opinion market, Western narratives don't sell, practically don't sell at all. Even inside South Korea, and that's something that our friends know very well, since we are discussing with those people, we are trying to counteract what they're doing inside South Korea. On South Korean opinion market, there is a very strong pro-Putinist group. People like Professor Lee Hae-yong, whom we are also trying to discuss against, who basically consider Putin a fighter for anti-hegemonic third world interests. So, and South Korea, if you remember, it's American ally. So the thing is that I'm not sure that Russian imperialist is non-hegemonic. I'm afraid it is. I mean, in many ways, it's America, it's just smaller America. It also
respond. This is a great question. This is, of course, I pose it myself because I mean, that's the obvious question. When I make a strong claim, we need to face the strongest argument against it. My answer would be that that propaganda doesn't equal hegemony. That if you look at the American propaganda and whatever, like cultural industry, it strives on self-criticism. It strives on flexibility, on constantly undermining itself and so on, which reinforces hegemony as a broader political and economic project. If you look at the history of American hegemony, Russian ideology is pretty straightforward, pretty, simple, right? And that's why it's not hegemony. It doesn't constitute. It's part of hegemony. Could be part of hegemony. Hegemony, which I mean broadly by Gramsci as a political economic project, but it's very thin, and it mostly strives on the discontent with the countries where these people live. They use the tool of what they hear from Russia TV and so on to criticize what's happening in France, what's happening in the US, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't mean that they are ready to rise up and support Putin in any sort of or go back to Russia and so on. So this is not hegemonic in a broad sense of a certain political movement, aspiration, project. But we can discuss it. I don't want to take time from Alona, sorry. We can discuss it later. It's a very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, that is an extremely interesting topic, the very notion of hegemony in the context of the current inter-imperialist competition. So thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation, really fascinating presentation, and gave us lots of food for thought, I think. So thank you very much. And now we are going to Alona Liasheva's presentation about the strategies of resistance by the Ukrainians who are affected by Russian invasion, by Russian occupation, and how those quotidian ways of resisting the invasion and occupation also influence the political consciousness of the people on the ways how the quotidian resistance and political consciousness interact. That's a very fascinating topic. Alona, thank you very much for joining us. And I guess so, if you manage to put it into 35, 40 minutes format, then we have enough time for questions, I think. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot for your invitation and for giving us like time and space so we can in detail explain our ideas and our research. So I'm Alona Liasheva. I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Bremen. Already I'm finishing my postdoc project, and I'm based in Lviv, Ukraine, and I was based here before the invasion, and I'm still here. And also I'm a co-editor of Commons Journal together with Volodymyr. We already for quite a long time work in this collective. And today I'm going to talk about the research I've started in early days of March last year. Before the invasion, I was studying urban protest and urban resistance. So I was more into urban sociology my whole career. But with invasion, I felt that such topics as housing or urban infrastructure are very relevant, but the answers to what's going to be with Ukrainian housing system or with our cities very much depends on other question, you know, if the cities will be bombed or not. So I changed my topic to studying Ukrainian resistance to the invasion. And still, of course, it's very difficult, you know, to put things together, because while you're looking at something which is changing dynamically, you cannot, you know, and of course, you need time to collect data, you need time to think, you need time to read. So it's difficult to come to some conclusions. So you will see a lot of like 3 dots in this presentation, meaning that I'm still thinking about the ideas I share with you today. And my presentation is not okay. So first I will, you know, give a short general introduction about how we could somehow make periodization of the last year in Ukraine. Then I'm also going to talk about Gramsci, and it's quite a coincidence, by the way, that we both at some point started reading Gramsci, and I read him in a completely different way, I would say. Also in this presentation, I will talk a lot about methodology. This is something new. I never considered myself as a sociologist who works on methodology, but war imposed some certain conditions on how we do research and how we organize it and how we actually connect with people. And yeah, in the end, I will try to to make an attempt to frame this war probably in a different way compared to how it's been framed and how other wars are being framed. Yeah, so just a short reminder and summing up the news from Ukraine throughout the last year. So as you all know, on the 24th of February, Russian invasion started. And I will immediately, comment that for a lot of respondents, actually probably for 100% of people with whom I take interviews, this phrase like 24th or February, it already something which carries a lot of sense as a turning point in their life, as a turning point not only in their personal life, but in the way they see themselves, the world, Ukraine, and so on. And yeah, for a lot of meaning in Ukraine, this event is something which starts a new page. The same, I would say, and of course, it's we could not say that it's like this for all Ukrainians, but certainly such events as first the occupation of Kyiv Oblast, it became something very important because in the beginning of the invasion, as a lot of people expressed it, they were not sure if Ukrainian state will actually able to resist the invasion, and there was this not understanding if Ukraine will exist. And when Kyiv Oblast was deoccupied, it's an event that actually showed that yes, okay, we're not gonna live in a state which has two governments. We're not gonna need to become partisans. We will live in a country which is in a war with other country, but we're still, Ukraine. And of course, another event which is often highlighted in interviews I collect is counteroffensive of Ukrainian army, which started, it of course started before September, because counteroffensive is something which you need to prepare a lot for a long time, but counteroffensive, which actual results of this process we saw in the beginning of September. It also is an event which is often highlighted by people when they explain their experiences. And now we're expecting further developments in the war, but we learned, throughout this year that making predictions is just something not that useful in this kind of conditions. So why I'm, starting with this explanation, because I structure my research very much around this turning points, but turning points not in the way they're presented on the media, but in turning points which people describe themselves. And I'm trying to collect interviews between, these points. But it also very much depends on the group of people I'm talking about, because if for some people the occupation, for example, of Kharkiv Oblast is not that important, for example, for people who live in southern regions of Ukraine, because Kharkiv is in the east, it's far away, but for them, the occupation of something which is close to them becomes more important event. And my slides are not changing. I don't know why. Yeah. sorry, I'm not sure if it's the slide I want. Sorry, let's make it like this. This will be easier. Yes. So yeah, and as it was many times already discussed, the Ukrainian resistance and Russia-Ukrainian war is often presented on this level of imperialisms, which are somehow interconnected, but it's definitely not the focus I take, because I'm trying to look at this process from micro level and to understand Ukrainian people as the main subject, revolutionary subject, if we use Balibar's explanation of revolutions. In this case, okay, it's not revolution, but we can talk about a subject of resistance. And I look at this main subject of this resistance, not really taking into account Ukrainian state or NATO. I'm not saying they do not have, influence, or they're not players in this game, but if we, but for Ukrainian people, of course, how they see it is that they are doing something in this resistance, and that's what I'm trying to understand. And in this research, like the general research question is about that from the very first days of the invasion, it was quite clear that there is a strong consensus in Ukrainian society that we need to resist Russian aggression. We could see it from social media, we could see it from the lines to the army offices, vійськкомати. Probably, Volodymyr, probably you could text me how is it in English, because I forgot. So like offices where you join the army.
Recruitment offices.
Yeah, to the recruitment offices of the army, that for Ukrainians in different parts of the country, it's a common sense that we need to defend ourselves. But at the same time, this like red line, this red line, it now unites people, it now sort of, drives them, but at the same time, different groups still have their different understanding of what's going on, why do we need to resist, why do we need to do this or the other thing. And my research is rather focused on for what are we resisting? What do we want? And I'm coming closer to the methodology of research. In the interviews, I'm trying to find out not only this like mainstream narrative, which we can see on the media, but also to question how people see things which are not that obvious if you look at mainstream media. For example, something which I already mentioned, the attitudes towards NATO, because of course in a survey, if you ask people, and it's being done there, I have a lot of criticism to the surveys which are now being launched in Ukraine. But even without all this criticism in a survey, if you ask a person like, what's your attitude towards NATO, he or she will just say like positive, negative. At the same time, if you ask more questions about NATO, you will hear a lot of ideas which completely contradict each other. And this applies to many other questions, including like what people think about Zelensky, what people think about the army, what people think about other Ukrainians, for example, Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians or Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and so on. yeah. I will change slides in this very weird way, but I do not have a lot of them, so. And yeah, I already started talking about surveys, and that sometimes they show not what they actually are implied to show. So as in my previous research about urban conflicts, I focused on in-depth interviews as my main method. At the same time, as a person who, you know, lives through the same events which I discuss with my respondents, I'm also doing participatory observation. And when I started this research in March of 2002, I immediately realized that now I'm in completely different conditions compared to how it used to be before, that I need to pay a lot of attention to security of like personal security of my respondents, that I need to also be ready to be not only a sociologist but also a psychologist. So I learned I spent some time to learn some emergency psychology, and of course talking about especially occupied territories, I had to make a decision that I'm not gonna speak with people who are now on occupied territories. It was a very complicated decision for me as a researcher, because on one hand, I was very interested in talking to them. And there were some people who were ready to give interviews while being under occupation. At the same time, I had to think about their dangers they might face. So I had to take this decision first time in my career, though I've made hundreds of in-depth interviews, but I followed, you know, the interest of my respondents. So all of the interviews I'm gonna analyze in this presentation and share with you were done with people who either were evacuated from occupation or these interviews were made after the occupation of certain region, for example, Kiev Oblast. And yeah, in this research, it's a qualitative research, I was very much focused. While I was recruiting people, I was very much focused on like grasping the biggest variety of opinions of first of all, political opinions, meaning that I was precisely looking for people who express, let's say, non-mainstream vision of what's going on. What does it mean in practice? That I was looking for people who, for example, did not support Maidan protest. I was looking for people who voted for Yanukovych, so for like pro-Russian president years ago. I was looking for people who were like sympathetic towards Russia or sympathetic towards DNR, DNR, so the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk People's Republic before, or even now. Also, some of my respondents. Also, I was looking for respondents who support the idea that how you call it, that Ukraine need to stop resisting like now. I did find people like this, but of course, like the majority of my respondents, they retranslate this mainstream vision. So by this I mean that I really worked hard to grasp the biggest variety of opinions in Ukraine. And yeah, of course, the sample of the respondents is organized around all this like typical criteria like gender, age, class. But the other of my criteria was to try to find the variety of opinions and see how they changed, how people changed, from being, for example, sympathetic to Russia, because we saw it in the surveys that people, I mean, there was definitely like several dozens of percent, like 20-30% of Ukrainians who could be described as like sympathetic to Russia in one or the other way. And then after invasion, somehow these people are not there anymore. And that's why I try to understand, also I will try to understand through this data which we collected of how people, change their opinion. But also this like change of worldview and of politics, it did not happen only with people, who were like pro-Russian and became pro-Ukrainians. It also people share a lot how they reconstructed their whole vision of the world. But in this presentation, I will rather talk about everyday life level. So I will not touch the political part of the interviews I conducted. And probably if we're talking about Ukrainian resistance and its everyday life level, what we can see is that for many Ukrainians, what happened on the 24th of February is this rapid politicization, rapid understanding of that, okay, I'm part of the society and I need to do something. That's how people often describe their experience, but they might not, change their political opinion, but politics in a very broad understanding, including activism, including volunteering, including joining to the army, became like part of their daily life. This slide, while I'm talking, you can read this. I give big quotes because it's also sometimes like difficult to just find one phrase. So while I'm talking, you can see how a volunteer from Kharkiv, how she described her experience, that with the invasion she realized that she does not want to go on with the life she had before of like doing business, having a cafe, and she turned her business into a volunteer project. And in other parts of the interview, she also shared how for her it really affected her economic, of course, income, that she basically now does not have any resource for some extra spending, that she like stopped getting how you call it, sorry, yeah, like profit from what she is doing. And this is like a common narrative among Ukrainians. But of course, there is a question for us as Marxists. Okay, we have this like rapid splash of politicization, but how will be it? How it will be become an institution? Will it, last for long? And of course, some will, but the most interesting part is the nature and like class nature of these new initiatives, of these new groups. And it's quite difficult to answer, what kind of political spectrum we will have after the war. It very much, of course, depends on the result of the war. But yes, definitely, it's not, a surprise that part of this spectrum will be quite nationalist veterans or quite nationalist groups, which, will build their politics on this heroization and on this idea of Ukrainians being this strong nation which got rid of occupants. At the same time, this does not only, like this process of politicization did not only affect the people who are on the right, it also has affected many other groups such as workers, students, and so on. And it's very also common idea that people who now support, and we're talking about, vast majority of Ukrainians, people who now support the resistance, that they say that, okay, first we will get rid of the occupants from Russia, and then we will get rid of the occupants who are here, in their city or in their region. And it's a common like narrative to compare, like Russian elites to Ukrainian elites, saying that like, yeah, like Ukrainian elites are our elites, but they're also elites, and this kind of narratives. Yeah, also another group which definitely got politicized are women, but it's not, but it's more often like women's initiatives than like feminist initiatives, but which are in their sense are very feminist. So groups of women who, for example, join to volunteer or to support refugees or to support the army, they do not call themselves feminist, but what they are doing is actually very emancipatory. So it's like an example of, we do not know what's going to happen with these groups of women. Probably they will like join the feminist movement in Ukraine, but probably they will stick to a more traditional kind of self-organization, or probably they will, create something else. Yeah. I'm talking already for quite a long time, so I will try to, come closer to. Yeah, like that's already something I've shared, that this resistance, it means very much mutual aid between people, and of course a big part of this mutual aid is channeled to the army, because of course Ukraine, as many other countries all over the world, met the invasion while being super neoliberal, while being super free market oriented, at the same time corrupt, and with rule of oligarchs, which were also like stealing from the army. So especially in the beginning, Ukrainian army lacked supplies, and sometimes very basic supplies like uniform, like vest jackets, helmets, and so on. And this was all organized and still is being organized through this networks of aid. People collect money and buy, for example, drones or buy cars and bring them to combatants. And this became such an important thing now, not only because people support, the idea of the resistance, but because the combatants whom they're supporting are actually their relatives. And of course, you do not think about like nation or whatever while you're bringing, the car. You think about your son, your boyfriend, or girlfriend, because as you know, Ukrainian army has a lot of women there. But it's another huge topic about women in Ukrainian army, and at the same time that they are allowed to be there, and it's yeah, I'm not gonna spend time on it. Super interesting, but next time. Yeah, but probably that's what I wanted to focus on, is how sorry, yeah, and it's also something I already talked about, that in this process of self-organization and mutual aid, people develop what could be called this exclusive war knowledge about how do you survive when there is no water or heating or electricity, or how you organize, this mutual aid, how you even like cook for many people, and so on. But at the same time, this I have it just a hypothesis which I'm thinking about, that this exclusivity of this knowledge in the future might become quite a conservative thing, especially when we're talking about international relationship, because already there is a lot of criticism towards West, which was not there before, because of not efficient support of Ukraine. And this, anti-Western ideas, they could turn to the left, which we, of course, would like very much. But there is also like a risk, and a huge risk, that they might turn to the right, when people would say like, yeah, you did not support us enough, and we are, so special, we survived the war. And so it this like skepticism, this like Euro skepticism might turn to a different direction. But of course, I'm just like speculating now, because it's very difficult to with certainty predict anything. But yeah, the thing I wanted, probably I already mentioned several times, but what I wanted to focus on is that while being so sure about that we need to resist, we need to continue to be in war with Russia, and reproducing this like mainstream narrative of like good Ukrainians, bad Russians, or so on. Underneath this, people keep to be very critical, especially in the socio-economic issues. For example, the typical question I ask in my interviews, I ask people to evaluate Ukrainian government. I ask them, do you think if Zelensky and his team did some mistakes in the last year? And the common way to answer this question is that, oh, okay, in terms of what they're doing, against Russia, they're amazing, but, and then you can hear a lot of, anti-oligarchic or which is more rather like working class kind of ideas and narratives, or like anti-corruption narrative, which of course rather like a liberal understanding of what's going on, and they're often, of course, all together, not not a surprise, and at the same, and this, proves that the support of Zelensky we have now is very much a conditional support. Yes, it's strong when we look at the surveys, but when we actually try to understand, we understand that people do support him while he resists Russia. The moment he, and this is also another question I ask people, like, what are you going to do if tomorrow Zelensky decides to give some part, to leave some parts to Russia? And often people just say, no, it's impossible. So they just cannot imagine this scenario. But if they imagine, they start to explain how are they gonna attack office of president, violently. No one, now. Yeah, the understanding of violence has changed, of course, over this year. And when people talk about future protests, they often also talk about like a violent protest, but it just a remark. So yeah, like if we try to, somehow frame this war not from a position of NATO, Russia, but from a position of how the resistance works, we're not gonna talk about like events, figures, or heroes. Instead, important, like notes on this map or on this timeline are bombings. It's something, my city was bombed on that day, on that day, on that day. Of course, it's occupation, deoccupation. That's how people frame their life, that, okay, I was under occupation, and after the occupation, it was different. For other people, of course, it's experience of displacement, that I lived peacefully and quietly, for example, in Kharkiv, and then I took my bag and ran away. Another like important like note is absence of utilities or some like basic things. Also very common point is joining the army, but not only just a remark that these interviews are only with non-combatants, because I plan another part of the research with people who demobilized from the army, but unfortunately it seems that it's not going to be soon that I will be able to talk to veterans. But joining the army is a big event for members of the family, friends, and so on. Another thing is new skills and knowledge people adapt, living, either under occupation or even even here in Western Ukraine, where I live, we needed to learn how to live without electricity the whole winter. I needed to learn how to organize my Zoom meetings because I had electricity only 4 hours during the day. And of course, it's death. It's another point which for people, deaths of people they know, and it's something which is of course changing with time, that we have more and more people who were killed, and it's like this personal experience which also changes the vision of the war and often radicalizes people one more time. Yeah, so I'm not saying, you know, I will be able to frame this war soon, but these are the points I'm trying to use to narrate the history of Ukrainian resistance, dragging them from the experiences of Ukrainians now. Yeah, I think I did not miss anything important. But yeah, let's talk. We not to take time.
Thank you very much for a very touching presentation. I cannot even use the words like interesting or fascinating, given the topic of what Alona has been talking about. Very touching, very informative, and also it's important to us also methodologically about, we learn about the ways of doing anthropology, ethnography of war bottom up, doing it in a way, looking at how ordinary people in a way accumulate political and other experiences and start to articulate themselves differently in the midst of resistance during the war. Thank you very much. And now it's time for questions and answers. So I would propose that maybe we can stop sharing the slides. Just a minute. And then, yes, thank you. And then now we can follow the same strategy. That is, you either raise your electronic hand or write in the chat. If you write in the chat, I will read the question for you to Alona. Otherwise, you use this function which I showed you now. That may be the easiest way to do so. Then you articulate your question yourself orally. So, who is going to ask the first question? I myself do have lots of questions, but I'm first. I think I don't see any raised hands so far. Okay, so while people maybe are still thinking, then I will start asking my own questions, I guess. And I have many. One of them, for example, is the issue which I'm sort of very curious about it. If you look, for example, into Donbas area or this southern belt, the coast, Azov Sea coast, and the areas there, and if you look into the attitudes of, for example, factory workers, so do you really think there are any genuine, in a way, grassroots pro-Russian sentiment there among the people whom we customarily call proletarians, maybe based on the idea, I'm not sure to which degree this idea, by the way, is realistic, that their factories may do better under sort of either Russian or pro-Russian regime. So, but can you say that factory workers, they are more predisposed to be favorable towards the Ukraine's northern eastern neighbor than, for example, non-workers?
I would say that it's not only case of Eastern Ukraine, but also of Southern Ukraine. An important point in the field work for me was in Nikolaev and Kherson, which are at the time I was there, of course, Kherson was deoccupied, and this is like a traditional electoral base of like pro-Russian parties in Ukraine, and this narrative still exists there, but in a very particular manner, that we could continue trading with Russia, that we could go on, you know, if not Putin. So yes, people
So it's
used to be,
pro-Russia, anti-Putin in a way. It's interesting.
yeah, because that's what they, you know, that was the case before the invasion, that people expressed like this idea that okay, Russia is not a great country, but it's nice for us to trade with them, and it's a problem that we do not trade with them enough now. Now this changed to the idea that like we could, you know, trade with Russia and have like profit on both sides, if not Kremlin, who decided to start the invasion. And
Right.
talking about, for me, it's more difficult to talk about East because I did not have interviews there like recently, but I think it's a common trend for these groups of people who were actually like profiting, yeah, with economic relationship with Russia. That's why probably not all of them, but at least some part of them were more pro-Russian politically, but also what is pro-Russian, you know? To say that I would like to trade with Russia, it does not mean to support Russian regime, no? But yeah, now it's people talk about it with pity and blame for this Russia itself.
I see. Thank you very much. It was a very interesting point for me because I'm trying to follow the Telegram groups from Kherson, Mykolaiv, and also Berdansk area. And I don't know, I had a feeling that there was a bit of difference between, say, factory workers and non-workers when it comes to those topics. But thank you very much. And I think the next was Volodymyr and then Paul. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you, Alona. It was really fascinating to hear your presentation, because I work on a similar population and with a roughly similar approach. And my question comes from this sort of theoretical methodological angle, because you didn't elaborate on the notion of common sense. I would be really curious to hear more. Why? Because common sense is a sort of a mosaic, is a contradictory kind of collection of sedimented beliefs and previous worldviews and philosophies and whatever, and that's why it's so difficult to study, because they rearticulate each time differently. What I faced in my fieldwork is that it's one thing to interview a person in a kind of an interview setting, whether online or face-to-face. You can talk for a long time, and people may say contradictory things, but it's a kind of a semi-official thing, and people would hide certain opinions or would change them. In another setting, in a public setting, they would forefront a certain even more socially acceptable opinions than they do in the interviews. But when you hear what they talk about in the kitchen among themselves, or in my setting, it's in a line to receive humanitarian aid and so on, this would be even more different opinions. I would give an example of a woman who, in one instance, in one settings, she said that she feel like bitterness and hatred towards the Russians who betrayed them and so on. In another setting, she said that, well, and in general, she speaks Russian almost all the time. In another setting, she said that, oh, but this war is just a clash of these Americans and Russians, and Ukraine is just a battleground for it. And in in another setting, she said that she donates to the Ukrainian army, but she would not want her husband to go to war because it's corrupt, the army is corrupt, and so on and so forth. So this, it's like it's very difficult methodologically to grasp all the aspects of this contradictory ensemble. How do you do this?
Mhm. So yeah, that was for me. So my first interviews we took in March, and I already had I expected that there is a risk that people might not be willing to discuss politics at all. That if I ask them about politics, they will just, say, oh, we support Zelensky, blah, blah, blah. And that's why, first of all, like one of the things I do is that I formulate the questions in a way that I present the respondent that some ideas are relevant, are like normalized in the society. For example, I asked people that like, oh, some people in Ukraine, they think like this, and some people in Ukraine, they think like this. What do you think? So I already, try to normalize, let's say, non-popular opinion. But it was not the case that people did not want to talk. Like, actually, the contrary. So it's from the first days of the invasion, people were not scared to like criticize government. I was, shocked myself with this. So yeah, first I really try to like come to the interview with this attitude that I'm normalizing, for example, like speaking Russian, or supporting some ideas which are not mainstream, while I recruit people, while I talk to them. It's also the case that many people start. So when I offer people like, would you like to have interviews in Russian or in Ukrainian? They often say that, or in Ukrainian. And the first hour is they're trying to speak Ukrainian. And when I'm transcribing this is like, but then at some point, when after several jokes, they change to Russian, I'm like, phew, finally, because then it's easier for me to transcribe this, of course, when a person is like fluent in what she or he is saying. Another thing is that I at least recruit people face to face. This is, I think, it makes field work more difficult and more expensive. But thanks to the University of Bremen and our Volkswagen grant, we still can do this. So yeah, we travel. I have two other colleagues who collect interviews with me, and we travel to the, I wanted to say to the war zone, but we're already all in the war zone. At least recruiting people face to face, I think it's in these conditions. Yes, it's expensive, but then meaning resource taking, but it's something which helps us to overcome, because we need to have trust. Otherwise, we will just hear this like, otherwise you can just open like Zelensky Telegram page and read it. Yeah, because at two narratives, they exist at the same time. People can say that, yeah, it's a clash between Russia and NATO, and say that, okay, but I want to join the army. Zelensky government is corrupt, but I support Zelensky. After the war, we will take care of this. So yeah, but also the typical sociological, things like people correct themselves, but of course we write everything they say, and we take more we pay more attention to, I hope not, my respondents will not find this video on YouTube, that we more take into account what they actually said in the first place, not how they corrected themselves. But it's clear that in this kind of conditions, such things as like working on trust with respondent is something very important. I even, I recruited for my research team people who can like easily change from Ukrainian to Russian, who know who either lived in the east of the country or know the context very well. I am myself, I spent my childhood in Donetsk, then I studied in Kiev, now I live in Lviv. So I was looking for, interviewees who can, change from different, I cannot play now with this in English, but but it is a difficult task. I agree with you. This is something which is now, because otherwise you will get in interviews that Ukrainian army is amazing and whatever.
Thank you very much for answering this question. And now I think we have Paul's questions. Perhaps will be the last because we're obviously running out of our time. Please, Paul.
Yes, I have a cultural question that directly connects to your answer a minute ago, and that's precisely about the use of Russian and Ukrainian language. I understand that the government passed a lot of laws against the use of the Russian language. And I read about a month ago or 2 months ago that the government even removed like millions or hundreds of thousands of Russian language books from libraries. So I'm not asking you about, I mean, maybe it's not even true. You can tell me if it's not true. But if it is true, I'm wondering how ordinary people are reacting to the use of the Russian language and the government's positions about against the use of Russian language.
Mm-hmm. So the law about the Russian books in libraries is true, but I can tell you a story how I myself took a part in this process with a friend of mine who works at the library, because there is an exception for some books which could be, written down on the list of everything which is in the library as not books, but some like artifacts. And how my friend was like, okay, so let's say it's not a book, it's an illustration book, let's say. So, and it's a very Gramscian, process, how people invent ways not to do what is required. And yes, it's true that like Ukrainian state now follows this quite nationalistic language policy. It's been supported a lot by circles of like liberal and national civil society. But at the same time, if you now go in the street and speak in Russian, nothing is gonna happen to you. Lviv became like the first time in history became like a proper Russian speaking city because people from Kharkiv moved here and you can hear Russian everywhere. But it's also things which are changing very rapidly in such countries in Ukraine. And I really hope that after the war, the rights of Russian speaking Ukrainians will be a topic, because now it looks not really well on the state level. On the level of everyday life, but there is this phenomena, and I'm talking rather about, these circles of like journalists, of like cultural managers who are themselves Russian speakers, but they very much fight for a Ukrainian language. And we often have this completely absurd situation when me, a Ukrainian speaker, shouts at a person who, shouts at me in Russian about that we need to like cancel Russian language, and me in Ukrainian shouting backwards and saying like, no, and this is a mess. I hope that after the war, this language issue will, calm down somehow.
Can I follow up a personal question? You said you yourself participated.
It would be good to have it short, because we are running out of time and we have one more question after that. So, but yes, please.
No, I just wanted to know, you said you personally participated in removing Russian language books from libraries?
So my friend, she works at the library, and it was her task to
not you. Okay.
No, but I was at that time I was with her, and we were deciding how to keep the books in the library, how to organize the bureaucracy, like how to lie to the administration that we took them away.
Thank you. Okay.
But yeah, a lot of books are being taken away because it like depends on a person who actually works in the library, and in every different library there are like different people who work with different views. Some are very happy to remove them, some not.
Thank you. Okay, that's all. Yeah.
About the language, I wonder, I could ask some native Ukrainian speaker whether, for example, Ukrainian spoken by Zelensky or Aristovich, whether it's proper Ukrainian. Because to me, it sounds very much like an attempt to speak Ukrainian by people who are basically Russian speakers.
It's terrible. It's terrible. Even the Russian terrible. But...
Ukrainian speaker, and you can certify that they Ukrainian.
I've heard
is
worse. I've heard worse. Like my dad, he's native Russian, and now he speaks Ukrainian, and this is like so bad.
Yeah, it's interesting how it was those days. Okay, and the last question from Chon Son-jin, the Professor Chon is the head of our project, actually. So the question is, thank you very much for the sharing the first-hand moving interview with the Ukrainian people's resistance against Putin's invasion. Could you explain more about the revolutionary subject in Bolivarian sense you mentioned? What is the content of the revolutionary consciousness of the Ukrainian people? So is it a variant of liberal or nationalist consciousness? Perhaps not very much socialist, given the situation, time period, and so on. So how would you formulate what is revolutionary subject those days?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I use this Bolivarian idea of that revolutionary subject might come in different forms and different, senses, that it's not only like party or trade union, though like trade union movement in Ukraine is now only getting stronger. It's a small movement, but it's getting stronger in this kind of events. And talking about, like revolution, and that's why, as it's quite a fluid notion of revolutionary subject, I took this risk to apply it to Ukrainian resistance. And we're talking not about revolution, but we're talking about war. And if we try to grasp this consciousness, it's definitely anti-imperialist consciousness. This is not even like a question, and rarely Ukrainians perceive this war as something which is not resistance towards this like bigger power who tries to take over you. But applying these notions of liberal or nationalist or socialist, of course it's nationalist in this meaning that it's anti-imperialist. But is it a nationalist in terms of that it's for Ukrainian nation? Not always, and very much not always, because when you ask people this question, often people say that I want to defend my house, I want to defend my city, I want to defend my region. It's one, way to talk about it. The other way to talk about it is to be like anti-fascist in this narratives about Second World War, that Germans used to be fascists, now Russians are fascists, so we need to get rid of fascists. It's definitely not liberal, it's definitely not socialist, but it's a certain kind of nationalism. But I'm not a big fan of using, this three categories when we're trying to explain something that complicated as resistance of the whole country. Though I'm a socialist myself, and I would like this resistance to be socialist, it's not. So yes, it's a resistance for existence of certain nation, of Ukrainian nation, but what's inside there, it's not state for sure. And it's not the nation in this like traditional vision of a nation. It might be your home, it might be your family, it might be like future of your kids, what you think about when you answer yourself the question, why do we need to resist Russia? Or just for many people, it's very basic, like I do not like bombs falling on my house, and they're not still living through this period. Like probably in a year, we will have more elaborated understanding. But sometimes it's like this very basic things that people are not really ready to talk about, some abstract ideas, but they have this like basic understanding that like bombs are bad, they fly from that side. So yeah.
Thank you very much for your answer. And well, I guess that our time is slowly running out. If somebody has an absolutely desperately last question, something you're burning with the wish to ask. Okay, no more questions. Okay, then thank you very much, Volodymyr and Alona, for two extremely interesting talks with lots of information, which it's not the sort of stuff we usually find on the pages of The Guardian or other papers who pretend that they cover the events in Ukraine, but they often cover it in a very one-sided way, and certainly not in a bottom-up way, certainly not attempting to hear what people on the ground really see and talk about. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting, and it's also important for us, as Volodymyr mentioned, in devising the left strategies. For example, for us, the Korean leftists, it's important because Ukraine is so much on agenda in South Korea, since South Korea is so related now to the events in Eastern Europe. It's important for us for that, and also to pluralize our understanding of imperialism, because as I have said, in South Korea, traditionally imperialism basically means United States. So, but now we came to the point where this understanding has to be more complicated. We have to nuance it now. Thank you very much, and I hope that we will meet again. So, and thanks to everybody who attended the virtual lecture. So I guess that our lecture is over now, and Kuhyon, maybe you will announce the next lecture. Or somebody. So we are going to have a series of the talks, and it's not the last one. So please follow the announcements. follow the announcements. Okay. You would like to announce the next talk?
Sungjin maybe talk about our talk.
Oh, thank you very much for all your great talks. And as Vladimir just mentioned, it is a part of a series of talks sponsored by Yongsang National University, Social Science Korea. And actually, tomorrow morning, we'll have other talk. The topic is different, but I will appreciate if all of you could join the talk. Vladimir, thank you very much. And many thanks again for all your.
All right, we have it tomorrow. Right,
Yes.
exactly. Aaron Benanov, right, exactly. Okay, so then I hope that as many people as possible would participate. So thank you very much, and I hope to meet all of you again.
Thank you. It was an honor.